Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. A big welcome to all of you. My name is Laura, and I'm delighted that you are joining us for today's ESPC community webinar. Today, I am joined by Cillian Bissett, who will talk to you guys about prompt engineering, where he will explore its nuances, intricacies, and its pivotal role in the world of AI. We love hearing what you guys have to say, so remember to join in on the conversation about today's webinar and more on X. Our handle is at ESPC_community and our hashtag is hashtag ESPC24. Tweet us at us and tell us what you learned. Don't forget to check out our Learning Hub, which is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. You can access and view the Learning Hub by visiting our website, sharepointeurope.com, and clicking the Content tab at the top. Don't let the learning stop here. Continue to keep up and stay ahead by joining us for our next Azure AI Week webinar, Prompts, Engineering or Art of Engaging with LLMs with Kazam Shaikha. This webinar takes place tomorrow, Wednesday, 17th January from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. CET. For more details on this webinar, please check out sharepointeurope.com/Azure AI Week. You asked and we listened. The ESPC 2-for-1 sale is coming back. Bring a colleague for free. Double the impact of your learning. With our 2-for-1 deal, you can bring along a colleague at no extra cost. Success is sweeter when shared, as they say, so seize this opportunity to multiply your insights and achievements. And as they say, 2 heads is better than 1. So what is a 2-for-1 sale? You can buy 2 4-day tickets for the price of 1, or you can buy 2 3-day tickets for the price of 1. And how does this work? On February 1st, you will be able to select 2 4-day tickets or 2 3-day tickets and then enter the correct code at checkout for this fantastic deal. So don't forget to put a reminder in your calendars for February 1st, 9 a.m. CET. And if I were you, I would act fast, as this is a once-off offer, and once it is gone, it is gone. You can get your code at sharepointeurope.com/ESPC 2-for-1 offer. Elevate your Power Platform work ethic and supercharge your savings, and save a whopping €500 on European Power Platform Conference 2024 tickets. But do hurry, as this offer is only valid until January 31st. And again, you can snatch up this offer at sharepointeurope.com/European Power Platform Conference pricing. So after the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any question you might have into the questions window, and questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Centre, where you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to today's webinar presenter, Cillian. Hello, Cillian.
Hey folks, how are you getting on?
Good, thanks for joining us, Cillian.
Yeah, no worries. I am just going to share my screen now, and hopefully you'll be able to see my presentation.
Yeah, that looks good.
Awesome, fantastic. So the aim of today, folks, I guess really is that there's a lot, the Azure OpenAI service has quite a lot of attention at the minute, and OpenAI and LLMs in general have quite a lot of attention at the minute because they are very obviously a fantastic new capability that's available to everybody now. And what I want to kind of explore, I guess, is what do you need to think about from the perspective of, say, a cloud professional, data professional, or anybody working in technology more broadly to kind of properly take advantage of what's now come available. So in terms of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to look quickly at the background and context. So where did this come from? Why do people care about it? You know, what is it exactly? Because there's one or two small distinctions people need to be aware of. Look at where it could be used. Talk a little bit about best practices, and importantly as well, talk about things like, you know, building a safe service, and kind of at a high level talk through what you need to do. I have one or two small little code snippets to show how simple it is to talk to the service, and finally we'll talk about making it a success and finish off with some conclusions. So we'll go into the background of what I want to talk about. So really, over the last probably 8 years or so, since 2016, interest in data science and machine learning has really been growing quickly because in that time frame, not only do we discover kind of new techniques, our hardware also got an awful lot better too. And the kind of tooling around data science is getting substantially better. Think about the difference in, say, a Python library like Pandas or scikit-learn or Altair, in the last 5 or 6 years, and how much they've grown. And as that tooling got better, we had new techniques, the demand for those skills grew an awful lot. And when ChatGPT launched, that put a really big spotlight on things like machine learning and AI as a really concrete example of how much better our capabilities have gotten over the last number of years. And after ChatGPT launched, it felt like in rapid succession, there was a pretty quick release of a series of new capabilities. So we've got GitHub Copilot and M365 Copilot are the two big ones from Microsoft. But not only that, even the background slide, for example, my professional headshot is AI generated, So there's real change here. But the big problem, I guess, to take advantage of it is that developing your own AI from scratch is really, really hard. And that's why access to pre-built models is so important. And that's partially the main function of the Azure OpenAI service. It can give you that kind of access. And there's a couple of caveats here we will need to talk through. But you can kind of see here, at the bottom, just tracking out that kind of story. You can see from about the middle of 2016 onwards, the search term interest in areas like artificial intelligence and machine learning were growing pretty quickly as we built better and better tooling. And then all of a sudden, in 2022, 2023, new capabilities come out and the field just explodes, And I guess what motivated me to talk a little bit about this service is that I like to think a lot about how you engineer for AI, right? So when we go back about 8 years, when data science was that hot topic, organizations decided they wanted to do data science, and they were hiring really large data science teams, but they didn't maybe think as much about the engineering capability needed to let those new people do the work that they want them to do. There's no point in having 10 data scientists with PhDs from Harvard if they haven't got any data to use that PhD on, to be honest. So when we talk about this kind of engineering capability, it's things like, where does your data sit? Where do you host your workloads? All that kind of typical stuff. How do you make it secure? How do you make sure end users actually like what your people are building if it's a customer facing product? And in the context of AI, what we've kind of seen is that a lot of people are learning how to build and train models, which is really, really important. But I don't really want to focus exclusively on model training today. I want to focus on that idea that I mentioned of there being a bit of an engineering gap. And generally what you need to know, especially in terms of the cloud, to help roll this service out, and think about that kind of engineering gap. You can kind of see that interest in data engineering was pretty flat until about 2019, well after interest in data science had started to explode, and that's kind of the proof of the pudding that, the enablement work, the work that let data scientists do data science, we didn't realize that until after the fact. Now, the nice thing is that we've kind of learned that lesson pretty well. And if you look at the Microsoft documentation, what you're going to see in a really big way is that they put a big focus on how you build this out successfully. And if you look through a lot of documentation for different certification paths, they will talk about a lot of things you need to worry about, So bearing in mind that there's this idea of an engineering gap, I guess, what do we need to talk about, and what is the Azure OpenAI service, and why do we really care about it? So the OpenAI service is kind of the crux of this. So OpenAI has probably become one of the best known companies doing cutting edge AI research, and they're one of a very small group that are developing the models that are powering the really famous applications that we see in the news, like ChatGPT is what they're best known for. Now, like I said, developing your own advanced models is hard. Building like a simple regression model or a classifier or whatever is very doable. There's good tooling to support it. Again, I mentioned before things like scikit-learn. But if you want to look at more advanced things like large language models, vision models, they need much greater compute. They need a lot more background knowledge. There is a higher level of inherent complexity, and there's just an awful lot of challenges there, So what the Azure OpenAI service does is that it takes that really cool technology that OpenAI have built, and it makes them available to people And the key message that I want people to remember is that resources are still just resources, even if those resources are doing cool things. So you will have an AI model sitting in your Azure tenant. That is a cloud resource. So a lot we know already about working in the cloud, and generally speaking, best practices will all still apply. And probably the big thing to think about is that it's been quite topical, I think, that some companies have had big data breaches from employees using the ChatGPT website to research things for work, troubleshoot code, that kind of thing. Samsung in particular were in the news for having an awful lot of trade secrets leaked. The big thing with this is that your data stays private, and Microsoft are incredibly clear on this, and they have a very strong message. All right, everything that you do stays private. It is very different from the web-facing application that's been in the news. So the things you type into it, the things it spits out, your training data, everything else, none of that is available to other customers. So you don't need to worry about a competitor nicking all your trade secrets. It's not available to OpenAI. So OpenAI won't be able to let their researchers see what you're putting in or what it's spitting out. And it's not used to improve OpenAI models. And that's really important, because suppose your data was used to improve those models, there's actually a small risk that those models could spit that information out verbatim if somebody prompts it in the right way. It's not used to improve any Microsoft or third-party products or services, and it's not used for any automatic improvements of your own models for your use in your resource. All right, you must explicitly fine-tune your models. So they're really putting this big emphasis on your data will be secure if you use the Azure OpenAI service. So in the context of an enterprise that's thinking about, right, how can we use AI? If you're using the Azure OpenAI service, a lot of those topical concerns around data privacy are taken very seriously by Microsoft. They're very explicit about it, and we can kind of be aware of that, I guess, walking into those conversations with key stakeholders before we start proposing solutions. So fundamentally now, we're in a situation where we have some really cool models, but the question is, where can we use them, and how do we take it from a POC to a really, really valuable tool that's actually generating business value? So again, as technology enthusiasts, we love building really cool things in POCs, but ultimately to kind of get that confidence to let us do more experiments in the future and give us, that kind of freedom to try new things, we do need to generate business value and kind of show people, look, what we're doing right now is really valuable and helpful and making people's lives much, much easier. So put yourself in the perspective of a customer care support manager of some sort, and imagine, you're trying to run a call center or some sort of chat-based support service. A big thing here is that you're able to craft high quality communications out to service users and customers, things like responding to email complaints, things like summarizing complaints, things like writing emails, and it's pretty well suited to that kind of a thing, because that's very much a well-defined language task. The second thing that you might think about is text analysis. All right, so a lot of the language models behind the Azure OpenAI service are very good at summarizing information in documents. You supply the information, you ask for a summary, it spits out a summary. And it can really, really make life an awful lot easier in a context where you're having to wade through an awful lot of information. So imagine, for example, you've got a list of reviews for, your customer support center, and you want to get that summarized. There are techniques for analyzing that without using AI. However, a large language model will be very good at synthesizing the important information from all those reviews once it reads through them and pulls out the key information. Another example that I've seen it used for is tender responses. So if you're, for example, a public sector organization, you put some work out to tender and say 5 or 6 vendors come back, each with potentially thousands of pages of documentation to support their bid. One use case that I've seen is that AI would be ideally equipped to summarize all that information and make it a much more achievable task to get the key information. Now, you can't fully replace the entire thing of making sure everything is exactly as it needs to be in that use case, but it can be very, very helpful for establishing at a high level what different vendors are kind of bringing to the table. Probably the most famous one, and the one that people see the most, especially in terms of GitHub Copilot, is the idea of a chatbot or an assistant. So one thing that people do have started looking at the viability of is refining a large language model based off a knowledge base and creating a virtual assistant based off that model. Now, in the past, you could use Azure Cognitive Search to find relevant documents, for example, to certain topics and get the right information pretty quickly. What people are exploring now pretty actively with the Azure OpenAI service is it feasible to get a model to read those documents and answer questions much more directly off them and in a format that's much more easier to be immediately reused, you know? And this is all very focused on language models, but again, code completion is probably the one that I would personally interact with the most, using, for example, GitHub Copilot for personal use at home. And image generation is another very, very popular one. I'm sure everybody's seen some of these AI images that are generated, which could be all sorts of crazy stuff, you know? Now, again, I'm sitting here saying this is really useful, it can solve loads of problems. There is a health warning that comes with this. It's a really cool service and a really powerful tool, but it's one tool among many. For example, I did mention Azure Cognitive Services already. They might fit your situation better, so don't feel like because there's a new capability, this must be the capability that you use to solve your problem. You know, like there's a very well-known phrase, when you have a hammer, everything can start to look like a nail. But really, make sure you're not in the situation where you have a solution and you're looking for a problem. I talk a lot later on about how to actually make your projects a success with this. And a big thing here is that it comes down to talking to people and identifying pain points, you know? So if you want to start tackling certain use cases, and again, there's many, many more use cases and many companies doing very interesting things with it. What do you kind of do at a technical level? And the really important thing is that I want my key message from this slide to be that there's nothing new here, all right? It's all your general best practices, all right? So for example, if we're deploying a new workload into our environment that's centered around the Azure OpenAI service, we should be thinking in terms of the Azure well-architected framework, you know? So generally speaking, we still need to do a high quality technical delivery, even if it's in an exciting new field. And this comes down to your typical things, like for example, your reliability, which is handled at a platform level in the context of the Azure OpenAI service. But for example, if you have things like app services and key vaults and storage accounts and other databases involved, you know, you will need to put a little bit of effort into the architecture behind that to make sure you hit whatever kind of SLA you want to offer to your customers. Cost optimization is probably the biggest one where you'll see the biggest difference. Right now, if you want to use GPT-4 instead of GPT 3.5 through the Azure OpenAI service, that is 10 times more expensive. And the difference between, say, spending €10,000 and €100,000 is pretty significant. So that's something to be very, very conscious of. Now, granted, over time, as I mentioned before, our hardware is getting a lot better. We're uncovering new techniques. We're getting a lot more efficient. That cost will probably come down. But right now, the most cutting edge models like GPT-4 and in the future GPT-5 will probably be quite expensive for the next couple of years. And then, you know, looking out to the rest of the framework, it's things like operational excellence, you know. So again, this boils down to your typical stuff, like, you know, as a whole, is your solution still working as a solution for customers, or is the thing blowing up when they open the portal to do whatever they want to do, you know? Performance efficiency, that's things like, you know, is your workload scaling nicely? So again, we mightn't think too much about the model itself, but we might think about, you know, any clusters that it's running on or any clusters hosting applications that talk to that model. Again, it's not just we fire a cool model into our tenant and we let it do magical things with our information. What we need to do is we need to make sure it's deployed and everything around it is absolutely watertight. You know, and that brings us on to security. So security, again, this is very, very relevant nowadays. AI has gotten better and unfortunately is being used as a tool for cyber attacks. Right now we're at a point where hackers are using AI models to hack people's environments, which is an absolutely terrifying statement and an absolutely terrifying idea. So not just for your Azure OpenAI workload, but your entire tenant, always think in terms of security, because again, you need to protect what you have. And on top of that, many use cases involving the Azure OpenAI service, you are probably going to look at, you know, looking at your customer complaints, reviews, sensitive documents, potentially personal information. That is potentially quite scary if that gets breached. So again, think very, very carefully in terms of security. And more broadly, when we talk about things like DevOps, a big emphasis there is on shifting left, which includes things like security, UI, UX, and all this stuff. But again, that's a later thing that we'll dive into a little bit more towards the end. Data privacy, again, it's probably the most topical concern to do with the Azure OpenAI service. People are very worried about, how their data gets used, where it gets used, who can see it. And again, as I mentioned, Microsoft are very clear that your data stays in your tenant. It is your data. They won't do anything with it. But there's still some effort from your side to make sure that you keep the information secure, even from, accidental misuse within your organization. So for example, don't put all the information into a storage account that's publicly accessible to the whole wide world. And this can be a big regulatory issue, things like GDPR, HIPAA, and other similar regulations. And this is where we think in terms of things like, for example, how a data privacy impact assessment to think through what are the implications of hosting this data, letting this model talk to it, integrating it into some other kind of application that you're building, and what you can do to protect it more, and what are the implications if there is a breach. One thing as well that people are quite worried about is the idea of AI going rogue and effectively becoming a new Skynet, similar to Terminator movies. So when we talk about the responsible and ethical use of AI, again, this is stuff that Microsoft had very clear guidance on. They have their 6 principles, and I think they are an excellent 6 principles. Accountability. People should be responsible for what an AI model does. So if I build a model tomorrow to drive cars and that model crashes the car into a child, I should be responsible for that realistically, Things like inclusiveness. So again, there's 1 or 2 examples I'm going to talk about on the next slide, but don't release language models that are incredibly bigoted is a very basic example of this. But not only that, it's a lot more subtle. It's not a model in isolation. Normally built as part of a whole solution. So how do people interact with it? So for example, if somebody has problems with motor control, are you building a solution where they could perhaps use their voice to interact with the model instead, through using like some sort of voice to text application on their phone, for example? Really simple things like that, trying to think a little bit adaptive technology to kind of make sure what you're building works for everyone, is really, really important, Reliability and safety, very, very simply. AI models should not cause harm to people. Fairness, transparency, privacy and security. Again, all this stuff is stuff that is very much what it says on the tin. So if you can make transparency, tell people what data you're collecting, what you're going to do with it, how it's going to be used. Don't do anything else. And again, that goes back to things like your regulations like GDPR. Privacy and security, again, that comes under well-architected framework. Again, nothing more needs to be said here beyond, private data should stay private and sensitive data should be kept secure. But realistically speaking, right, I'm a big believer in living and dying by the docs effectively. Microsoft had very good guidance on a lot of things. Now, you need that knowledge yourself of how Azure works, how the service works, and all the other good stuff in order to make sure that, what you're building will do what you want it to do in the right way. So always be very careful, but normally speaking, if you want to do something, it is documented, and hopefully you can get some pretty good guidance on it, and failing that, you probably have partners or other experts within your organization that you'd be able to work with to get to a solution with whatever problem you currently have. So I mentioned a lot here at the very bottom about the responsible and ethical use of AI. This brings us on to the idea of the Azure Content Safety Service. So it's been pretty topical. I think that people have had problems with AI models going rogue, for want of a better word. Now, some of the high profile cases are kind of funny. So for example, Chevrolet rolled out a chat agent paired by a GPT model. That chatbot was agreeing to give away their latest models for $1. That's pretty funny. Back in February 2023, when Bing Chat was originally launched, it got very racist very fast against some users, which is slightly scary and is a massive, massive PR problem for Microsoft. You don't want to be in the headlines for releasing a robot that's, going to exhibit that kind of really problematic behavior. So what happens here is that in thinking about the idea of how to keep these models safe, and again, controlling model behavior is really difficult. That's where the Azure Content Safety Service comes in. And the aim here is that it'll help you filter the output of your models by letting you set kind of severity thresholds for certain classification models on whether or not something is likely to be harmful and whether users should be able to see it. All right, so again, it's very hard to directly make the model behave, but it's very easy to control the outputs and see where they go. So it's a little bit easier sometimes to respond to what the model spits out. Now, this has a full-blown studio experience. There's a custom solution preview coming along, which, again, details starting to come out about it. But the big thing to focus on is that if somebody asks you difficult questions about what the AI that you're building into your customer-facing website gets racist, there's a solution for that that should be quite effective. All right. Now, I have the URL there for the studio. And again, if you're going to look at using the Azure OpenAI service, this should be one of the first things you look into to make sure that what you build, I guess, won't cause PR problems for wherever you currently work. And again, those PR problems could potentially be quite severe depending on what it says or does. Again, some funny examples are on Twitter that are quite innocuous, but some are a little bit more scary. So anyway, that's the ideas about how we need to think about building it, the best practices, how do we make it safe? What we kind of need to worry about now is, well, how do we actually use the service? So at a very high level, skipping over all the security, all the privacy, and everything else that I've been harping on about for the last 20 minutes, it's a very, very simple process to start using the Azure OpenAI service. So first of all, you must specifically apply for access in your subscription to the service. All right, this isn't available to anybody who has the subscription. You must apply for specific use cases and get approved for those specific use cases. Once you're approved to use it in your subscription, you're able to deploy an instance of the service. And again, this can be very, very similar to other resources. It's more or less identical. And that'll give you access to the Azure OpenAI Studio, which you're able to see all the models and have a poke around and, you know, build cool models behind the scenes to power your applications. Once you do that, you're able to deploy a model to your OpenAI service instance. Now, they're deployed and managed separately from the underlying OpenAI service resource. They've got their own lifecycle. Now, it's tightly tied to your OpenAI service instance. But again, just to be aware, you will see extra resources in Azure if you start poking around at it. Finally, once your model's deployed, you're able to start sending requests to your model. And at this point, you're able to start building out whatever functionality you want to build out. Now, I have skipped over a lot of technical information here, a lot of the nitty-gritty. So go into a little bit more detail, firstly, on getting access. So like I said, you must submit a registration form to grant permission to up to 3 subscriptions that you own to gain access to the service. Now, there's a lot of requirements and the access is tightly controlled because the potential for this service to be abused, like I said, even with the Azure Content Safety Service, is pretty high. So first of all, you must be an approved enterprise customer. So I can't just make a new email address, get a new credit card, register for Azure and let rip with this. So if you're not an approved enterprise customer, that's probably where you need to talk to your Microsoft account manager and go through that process. So it's a very simple barrier. Again, it's very obvious what you need to do, but again, it's a very simple thing to overlook, I guess, you know. Once you're an approved enterprise customer and you start talking the registration form, you must detail each use case you want to use the service for. Okay, so if you're deploying the service in one subscription and you want to use it for 5 different things, you must give detail on those 5 different things. And if you want to try something else later, you have to fill out another form. So again, it's being very carefully controlled due to the potential for abuse, and that's why this information is looked for. All right. Now, if you want to modify the content filters, and again, thinking in terms of the Azure Content Safety Service and abuse monitoring, after you've onboarded, you're also going to be subject to additional eligibility criteria. Now, there might be use cases where that's valid. So for example, if you're an enterprise doing research on other ways to control the behavior of models, you might want to do that. However, generally speaking, if you want to modify content filters, I'd say be very, very careful with it because there's potential there for there to be a bit of a problem. And ultimately, you don't want to be the person who's deployed a model that went racist against all your customers. Again, which has actually happened in real life. So once you're filling out the form, you also specify whether you want access to text, code models, DALL-E 2, the OpenAI Whisper model, which is a voice to text model, I think it is. And again, they have a lot on offer. Pick the ones you want. And again, they have a lot of things called out that will sync your application or make you have to go back to the very start of it again. So for example, use your company email, not your personal one, include the details of the contacts you're using at Microsoft to go through the process and all that kind of stuff. So there's some pretty good guidance there, I guess, to make the process as painless as possible. So once you get access to the Azure OpenAI service, you then get to deploy it, which is the fun part. Now, I said earlier on that it is just another Azure resource, and that is very much the case. There's a couple of ways to deploy it. Now, personally, I'm a big believer in infrastructure as code. If you're at the point where you're building large workloads using, AI and all these other things, chances are I would steer you in general towards using IAC anyway, specifically to make sure that your environment is properly configured, locked down, secure, behaving as you expect it to, and get away from people making manual configuration changes, because again, that's when you might get a data breach or some other similar issue that could again cause a pretty big blast in your organization, a pretty big PR problem. And again, there's, for example, I'm a big user of Terraform. There's community Terraform modules that will let you do your provisioning, all right? And it only takes a couple of lines of Terraform, but again, you don't have to use Terraform. There's Bicep, PowerShell, and other tools, and they are all equally valid choices, and you kind of choose the one that works for you. Again, personally for me, it's Terraform. For the people, it might be something else. Now, I did talk about IAC services. You can also just deploy it through the Azure portal, which is very, very straightforward. There's a big fat deploy button. You fill out a little of information, the same as any other resource. And if you're just in the experimentation phase of exploring, you've got a big existing tenant with many other workloads, and you're just exploring what you can kind of do, this is pretty reasonable for experimentation, I guess, You don't want to immediately turn around and go straight whole hog, full complexity. Sometimes you just want to experiment, and that is completely fine. Now, once you finish your deployment, then the question becomes kind of, well, what do you get out of it? So once you deploy it, you'll get access to the Azure OpenAI Studio. And what this does is this is kind of it's like the Azure portal, but for the Azure OpenAI service. This way you can look at things like chat, completions, and other types of services. You're going to build out models to support your use case. And again, there's a lot of things still in preview. It's a very new service. ChatGPT only launched in the last year. The Azure OpenAI service is a very new service. So if you go in, you will see a lot of things are in preview. And if things are in preview, bear in mind, they typically don't have SLAs with Azure. So that is something to bear in mind, I guess, when you start playing around with it. If it's out of preview and it's general availability, there is an SLA behind the scenes somewhere that will let you know what kind of availability that you have. And that is probably a question you will get from other people in your organization. So that's something to bear in mind, Now, once you deploy your model, you want to interact with it. And interacting with your model is very, very, very simple. So there's a really small code sample here on screen, which shows just how easy it is. You'll need a key from your service, a little bit of information from your environment. You'll need to do some other configuration for the OpenAI service within your script or application. And straight away then you can start sending out prompts to your model and you'll start getting responses. All right, so it's very, very, very simple. All this information you can find through the Azure portal. Some other things are, for example, behavior prompts to tell the model how to behave. And again, that's pretty important because that's actually been pretty frequently used as a vector for making models misbehave. People tend to disregard instructions. So again, don't overlook that. If you want your model to be professional, tell it to be professional, and don't just roll with whatever the defaults are. All right. Again, other than that, whatever framework you're using, if you're building a web application, JavaScript or Python or whatever you're using, it's the exact same. All right. So this doesn't fundamentally change. Now, again, I have code on the screen that makes this look very, very simple, and it's very easy to write code that'll spit out information. Again, we always go back to our things like security, data privacy, ethics, reliability, and all that other stuff, all right? So again, it's exciting to show something that works to people, but please, 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 stay focused on kind of engineering excellence, for want of a better word. Now, when you're building these things, right, you can build the most wonderful thing in the world and it won't be successful if you don't do certain things, all right? And the things that make it successful, again, just like the idea of, well, what's the best practice, aren't really surprising. So if you want to be successful, one of the first things that you need to make sure that you do is actually work with the business. All right, use your relationships within your company to stay focused on where problems are and how you can help people and get buy-in. So basically, solve problems people care about. If you have a call center manager who is under a deluge of customer information, and you can use this service to make that deluge much more manageable, all of a sudden you're going to get buy-in and you'll have a lot of support to go off and experiment and try something new. One thing you should look at fighting for is an innovation budget. Now, it is somewhat expensive to start running this at scale, but in terms of innovation, you don't need to have thousands and thousands of euros lying around to experiment. Just make sure that you have time, not just money, but also time to try new things. So very simply, if you're in an organization that has some Visual Studios subscriptions lying around, use credits from those to build small POC to show to people. And again, basically take time to experiment and find stuff people like. And again, think in terms of other topical things in tech, like DevOps. Get feedback from people on those experiments, what they like, what they don't like, what can you use to make it better. Because it's very rare if you build something in isolation, it'll be right the first time. You need to get out and talk to people, to make sure that you're using, your budget effectively to solve the problems that people are caring about, And one of the biggest problems really with making this a success, and one thing that can actually be somewhat frustrating for people, is how difficult it is to stay current with all the capabilities, So again, it feels like every week there's another new model doing another new thing, or there's another new service coming out, or there's another new integration available. That can make it very hard to stay on top of what's there, all right? But if you've taken time to work out what problems people care about and you've got time to experiment, that should give you time to work out what's really available under the hood to help you solve problems for other people, all right? And again, very simple example, Vercel Cloud have actually templated out AI headshot websites. So they have a template where you can build an entire website that uses an AI model to generate professional headshots for people. And that's just the template. So again, that came out in the last couple of months. So the capabilities here are growing really quickly. So try as best as you can to stay current. It's nearly impossible to do it, to be honest, but again, we have to try. Now, an important thing as well, talking to non-technical people, is having a plan. Again, we might all really enjoy sitting down, playing with the model, trying loads of things and seeing how it works and pulling it apart and go down a bit of a rabbit hole. We do need to stay a little bit focused on solving, problems and actually providing business value. Now again, you need a certain leeway to try new things, but ultimately you need to have a plan to say within 2 months, we will hopefully have a proof of concept, or within 1 month have a proof of concept for how we might use this service to tackle 1 or 2 problems and start getting feedback. Once you have those timeframes, people will probably be a lot more on board. They'll understand, right, there's a process they need to work through, they need time to build it. And they'll try and help you because you're being specific about what you're doing. It goes from just being an unending experiment to a time-boxed activity. They feel like they are close to getting something valuable. You will get a little bit of extra support, And again, these are just the first 4 that I thought of. And again, every organization is different. You've probably seen something in your organization I haven't touched off here and could really help you and equally really help somebody else, So the big thing really is bear in mind, it's always going back to basics, working with people, make sure you have time and money to experiment, make sure you know what's available, having a plan. These are all kind of basic behaviors for making any project successful. So again, always go back to basics. Now, I spoke a lot about the idea of an engineering gap at the start of this, all right? And it's not just an engineering gap, it's a bit of an everything gap. So if you have one data scientist or one engineer who you're letting loose to build a POC or build a product, they might get something built that's pretty close to what you need. But truthfully, normally you will find there's a pretty wide skill set that you need. So for example, I started my career as a data scientist and I transitioned to cloud fairly early on. And I think that let me kind of see that firstly, there's a lot of things I don't know, truthfully, about other areas, but it kind of gives you an appreciation for the fact that professionals in different areas can bring a lot to the table. The obvious skills that I've spoken about a lot today is, like a data professional, your data scientist or an AI engineer, somebody who has that in-depth understanding of how the models work, who can fine-tune it and make it work better for your specific use case. The Azure OpenAI service sits in the cloud. You'll probably need a cloud person to make sure it's on a platform that's secure, reliable, works well, chances are you'll also be looking at security. And again, that goes back to your data privacy, avoiding data breaches, avoiding PR disasters from sensitive data being stolen. And then there's kind of the things that are often overlooked, you know? It's like UI UX. Is the product you're building actually nice for people to use? Now, it's very easy to think that we can just eyeball it and look at something and think we're building it well, but oftentimes people who specialize in this field will have really specialized detailed feedback and they'll be build something that's with some very minor changes, much, much better. You know, we talk about risk. To put it bluntly, if you're building a public facing AI model, could it get your company into legal trouble? That depends, and that's a question for a lawyer. And you should absolutely get somebody involved who has an understanding of what you're kind of being exposed to, you know? So for example, if somebody prompts your model and spits out everybody else's data, is that a problem? Absolutely. How do you manage that? There's people who specialize in it, talk to them, you know? And finally, QA, you know? Now, a lot of the time in software delivery, people tend to give testers a tough time, but truthfully, what you're building normally needs to work really well. People who work in quality assurance are really good at making it what you build, you know, not only meets kind of functional requirements, is there a text box people can type into, but also is just fundamentally speaking, just a slick, polished piece of work, you know? So there's probably even more people you could rope in. So for example, if you're building something very domain specific, you'd probably want to have a domain expert. You know, it's a never ending list. So definitely look really wide for people who can help out and make sure you build something that's really on the money and get away from it being kind of a closed off POC with just one or two tech people involved, I guess, you know? So there are a couple of challenges coming down the line. So again, we've kind of seen, we know what we need to succeed. We've seen what the behaviors are we need to succeed, and we've seen, you know, what kind of people we need to bring to the table. There is one very big challenge coming down the line, and that is the copyright question. So there's been quite a high profile case recently where the New York Times sued OpenAI and Microsoft over the use of copyrighted work. And again, this used millions of articles to train the model. And the New York Times is now saying that that model now competes with the New York Times. And the potential implications are pretty tough. So it's a long list of questions, you know. So for example, will everybody who's built a model using copyrighted material need to retrain it from scratch minus that data? You know, will that then degrade model performance? Because, you know, journalists have fantastic English. That is a great way to teach a model to speak English. If we move to non-copyrighted data, we have to use like ye old English from the 1800s to teach the model how to speak English, and we'll start speaking in a more Shakespearean style. Could legal snares like this create an environment where other service providers can jump in and get in ahead of Microsoft and OpenAI? Could they then become a different service you should probably want to consider more? Possibly. Will OpenAI just pay for access to that data and then just pass the costs on to users? Possibly. That's what New York Times were looking for originally. You know, are there other implications that I couldn't think of? Almost definitely, you know. And really, who's responsible if that model, if an OpenAI model in Microsoft Azure spits out copyright content in your system, if you do any level of fine tuning? Going back to the idea of humans are always accountable, that is probably you who's ultimately responsible, you know, which is slightly scary, you know, and that list goes on. And again, the more you pull it apart, the more you can see about, you know, how will I put it? There's challenges over the horizon. Now, the people who build these models are terrifyingly intelligent and they probably already have solutions built, but it's something for us to be aware of. We might need to change tack slightly on our approaches to some of these problems. So look, in conclusion, I guess, right, on a really simple level, the OpenAI service is a really cool piece of technology, but it does take a lot of work to successfully get it deployed. All right, you need to nail your basics across multiple domains, you know, data, cloud, cyber, and other areas. All right, you need to understand a lot about the work of the AI engineers and data scientists involved to support them as best as possible. And a lot of that comes down to having a wide team of professionals from different backgrounds who specialize in different areas where we maybe wouldn't expect an AI engineer or data scientist to have the same level of knowledge. So again, you bring in your cyber team, you bring in your cloud team, you bring in a UI expert, you know, and others to make sure that what we're building is 100% on the money. And once you understand what they're trying to do, you understand you can help them, you make it a success. The big thing I think that's most important though is really proactively engaging with people to see where you can add value. So again, I've referenced once or twice the idea of having a bit of a closed off POC in a tech team that other people can't access, or maybe it's not 100% in line what people might want. You know, get out and talk to different, product teams in your business and see what problems they have and see how you can map out, language models against those problems or other types of AI models against those problems, and if you can help them. Finally, having time to experiment is really big, and a natural part of experimentation is failure. Chances are you could build 150 different things, and chances are 10 of them work. I think Microsoft have a statistic that they estimated 2/3 of their ideas generated 0 or negative business value. So there's a good chance that your first attempt might not be on the money. That is a completely natural part of experimentation. And it's just try again, get feedback from people, and dial it in more and more and more to what they really need. And fundamentally, it's very hard to say what exactly your model will do under certain circumstances. Now, you have things you can use to help that, like the Azure Content Safety Service, but there is uncertainty, and that is slightly scary, and it makes life an awful lot harder. But to be honest, I think that's kind of part of the fun of AI, is that it's like, I'm going to be very careful with this next statement, it's almost like a living thing. Not saying it's sentient or like Skynet, but it sometimes looks like it has a mind of its own. And that makes it a lot more interesting, but also a lot more difficult. But fundamentally, that's why working with these kinds of things are very, very fun. So we budgeted quite a lot of time for Q&A because it's quite an open topic. So at this point, I'm going to say thank you very, very much for listening and see if you have any questions.
Thanks, Killian, for a great presentation. It was really insightful. So we'll get into the questions and answers part now. So again, if you wish to ask a question, please do feel free to type it into the questions window and we will get to it at the end. So there's a question in here and someone wants to know how the Office 365 suite of products content can be used with OpenAI.
Yeah, so I guess the big thing, that you need to always remember, again, this comes back to your kind of idea of tenants. So all your data is already in the same Microsoft tenant. Well, if you have a single tenant setup, we'll talk through this first because it's the easy case. If you have a Microsoft tenant and your OpenAI models are being provisioned in the same tenant as your Office 365 content, it is very feasible to integrate directly to Office 365. There's a lot of documentation on those integrations available through Microsoft Learn. And again, there are also things like, for example, M365 Copilot, which will already have learned quite a bit from your environment to help you kind of do work effectively. In a multi-tenant setup, that is very, very complicated, and truthfully, I wouldn't have an answer for that. I would need to sit down and think about that very, very carefully, because the big question, I guess, here is how can you make the data visible to OpenAI? To your OpenAI model. Same tenants, very straightforward, well documented. Different tenants, a lot less straightforward and probably a lot more complicated.
Brilliant. Then just the next question, someone is wondering, can OpenAI read data within Azure that is stored in an SQL database or blob storage or data warehouse?
Great question. No, so Microsoft are very, very clear on this. So, so they are very clear that any data that gets exposed to this service is not available to OpenAI. It's not used to improve OpenAI models. and it's not actually used by Microsoft to improve their products or services either. So your data is very, very safe, I guess, is the key thing. And your private information will stay private, which is probably the biggest selling point behind this service. And it's why we're able to now build alternatives, I guess, to that web-facing ChatGPT application that does have that problem.
Excellent. Thanks, Killian. So the next question is how DevOps engineering can upskill in generative AI, and how does one get started with this?
Okay, this is an absolutely brilliant question. So if you're a DevOps professional, I guess, you're probably approaching it from one of a couple of angles. You are most likely either a developer who has learned a lot more about running your products on the cloud, or you're more of an stereotypical opsy person who's learned a lot more about development and got embedded into an ops team and have skilled up in that kind of area too. Or you've joined the workforce after the DevOps movement became very popular, and you've kind of always just been a kind of natural DevOps role where you kind of do a bit of both already. So firstly, I wouldn't start with generative AI, which probably sounds completely counterintuitive. So I would start out learning the very, very basics of data science and how we break down problems to different problem classes, right? There's a big thing here about stereotypically the three flavors of problem that data scientists would talk about are regression, classification, and clustering, for example. That'll let you see how we try to frame problems and show them to very, very simple models, all right? Now, you don't have to learn the fancy calculus and algebra behind the scenes, but just understand vaguely what those high-level problems are. Once you know what those kind of problem categories are that we tend to worry about, in the past before AI became a thing, you can start digging into, well, how have people kind of deployed those other simpler models in the past? Once you do that, then you can start reading up a bit more in the basics of deep learning, because again, fundamentally, a lot of these models are just very big neural networks. And once you start reading more about deep learning, how neural networks work, you'll get a flavor. You'll have that conceptual understanding of what models try to do, and be able to apply the conceptual understanding to how these more complex models work. And having understood A, how simpler models work, and B, how we typically deploy them, you'll be pretty well equipped to understand how a more complex model works and how that can be deployed and ultimately sort of consumed by other people or applications. Again, a lot of the times, if you start reading into it, there's a lot of content that avoids the frankly terrifying amount of calculus and algebra behind the scenes. You don't need to know that really. Again, a lot of it is just, there's a lot of great, freely available open source content on it. There's a couple of very famous data scientists and AI engineers who run pretty high level courses that will help you write, for example, very simple Python code to build your first AI model. They are very good. There's a chap called, I think it's Cyril Eremenko. I did a course in Udemy from him about 4 years ago, which was Python for data science, I think it was. And I think it moves on to neural nets towards the end. And it's probably been updated since. That could potentially be quite a good course to consider doing. Anyway, sorry, that was a very, very long answer because that was very close to my own kind of trajectory in the workforce. Apologies.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Killian, for answering those questions. So there's just one last question in here then, and someone is asking, how long before you think Jarvis from Iron Man could come into existence?
Yeah, so I guess it's a great question, and what's kind of funny is that it feels like the individual components are there already. One thing that's gone viral recently, for example, is people are using AI models to generate very human-sounding voices, playing video games, for example, or just having conversations. And so we're able to make an AI read text and say the text like a human. We have another AI that can generate that text. The question then becomes, right, well, how do we run that on someone's local device, or could we just run it off a computer that's plugged into the internet? How much will it cost? Truthfully, the biggest holdback there will be the expense behind it. So, for example, GitHub Copilot is ran at a pretty substantial loss, according to the news I ran into a couple of months ago. So theoretically, a lot of the tools are in there. The problem is that stringing them all together in a cost-effective way is going to be the biggest barrier. And like I said, for example, GPT-4 is 10 times more expensive than GPT 3.5 through Azure. So if we want to go up that next tier of language model to really get something good that works in real time, we're probably still a number of years away from it, even though we have the sort of pieces of the puzzle, I guess, you know?
Fantastic, Killian. So just one more question then, or sorry, two more questions. So someone is saying, I am a data analyst and have experience building chatbot in Power Virtual Agents or Copilot Studio. However, I'm keen to upskill in this area. What would be the advice to kickstart?
Yeah, so what I've done personally to upskill myself is that Microsoft has a series of certifications available through learn.microsoft.com. This is probably saying something a bit like a Microsoft sales pitch, but their certification paths are excellent for learning how to use Microsoft services to build those solutions. And they are very good for getting you to an intermediate level very, very quickly, I guess. To a certain extent, you have to just do it to reach that advanced level. But for example, they have an AI engineer certification path, which will teach you a lot of the skills that you really need, you know? And again, for other related skills, like for example, I mentioned as well, you might want to have a data engineering capability to support this. There's a data engineering pathway there as well. And there's a cloud engineering pathway there as well. So again, whatever you want to learn to build, there is a Microsoft certification path for it that should be able to help you out along the way.
Brilliant, thanks, Killian. So another question then, how can OpenAI API be used together with Graph API to ground data?
How can the OpenAI API be used with Graph API to what data?
Ground data.
Ground data. Okay,
yeah.
I haven't come across the phrase to ground data before, but the big thing, I guess, you got two APIs. There is probably a way to have a service that talks to both of them and passes information, capture information from both of them and tie it up together. If you want to chuck in a little bit more context into chat, so I can give you a more useful answer, that would be awesome.
Brilliant. So we'll come back to that question then at the end if we get some more information on that. So the last question I see in here then is someone's wondering, can you share the recording when it is available? Yes, you will be emailed when the recording of this webinar is available. So do keep an eye on your emails. It should be later on this evening. Okay, so that is all the questions that we have in here today. So just on behalf of the ESPC community, I want to extend a big thank you again to you, Killian, for taking the time to carry out this webinar. We really do appreciate it.
No worries, happy to help.
Great, so that is the end of today's webinar. Sorry, I'm just after seeing that question, the follow-up come in there, so we might just run through that really quickly and then we'll wrap up the session. So they're saying the example I am considering is that using Graph API to retrieve data from Microsoft 365 services and then to send to OpenAI to get responses.
Yeah, so the way I would approach that personally, so you will have, let's talk in very vague terms here for a second. You have a script or some code that fetches data first from Microsoft Graph API. I would probably say, for example, let's talk with a very specific example actually, just to make this make sense. Let's kind of have a function app that wants to do this. The first part of my function app could send a query to the Graph API, put back to the function host. From there, communicate with your Azure OpenAI service model, get the output and pull it back. Function apps have limitations on their execution time depending on how they're triggered. So it might be the case that you might have, say, like an app service or a VM handle this instead. But that's probably how I would approach it. It's a very simple, naive approach, but it would probably meet the requirement pretty effectively.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Killian, for answering those questions. So that is the end of today's webinar. You will be able to find this webinar and more webinars at sharepointeurope.com/resource center. That is it for today, folks. Thanks again to everyone for joining us today. Take care, and I hope that you'll join us again soon.
Awesome. Thank you very much, folks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.